Good evening. This is Copernicus Festival 2017 Emotions. Our guest tonight is Professor Paul Bloom, one of the brightest stars in contemporary psychology. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind words. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for being such wonderful hosts. I'd like to thank the interpreters for their superb work on this difficult task. And I'd like to thank you all for being here. I started to write about empathy a few years ago. I started to think about it and came to the idea there were some problems with empathy. And my first attempt to talk about these problems was in a popular magazine. So I wrote my article, it came out, and then I became very interested in what the response would be. And I thought people might really like it. People might enjoy seeing a critique of empathy, and it might spark some interesting conversation. So the moment my article was published online, I went on social media to see what people were saying about it. And this is the very first thing I saw. So I'll read the tweet. It says, "Possibly the dumbest thing I've read ever." So, and a lot of the feedback I got on this work had a similar flavor. So I realized that this idea of being against empathy is not universally beloved. And I'm going to try, however, to convince you, even if you don't agree with my critique, at least to accept it's not the dumbest thing ever, to take it seriously as an argument. Now, part of the problem is that words like empathy, for both English but also in other languages like Polish, have many different meanings, the similar words. So sometimes when people hear that I'm against empathy, they think I'm against everything good: concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality. And I'm not. I'm for all of these things. Other times, people use the term empathy to refer to the capacity to judge what other people are thinking and feeling, to get inside people's heads. Sometimes this is called social intelligence or theory of mind, or mind reading, or emotional intelligence. And I'm not against this either. I think if you want to be a good person and make the world a better place, you have to understand what other people want, what makes other people happy. It's impossible to do good without that. On the other hand, this capacity isn't necessarily a force for good. Suppose you want to make people suffer. Suppose you want to cause pain. This capacity to get inside the heads of other people will help you do that too. So it's not only a tool for good people, it's also a tool for a seducer, or a con man, or a torturer, or a psychopath. In any case, this isn't what I want to be talking about either. What I'm most interested in was very nicely described by my favorite philosopher, Adam Smith. And he used the term sympathy, but the word we use now is empathy. And he described it like this: when we feel empathy for another person, we place ourselves in his situation and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensation, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. And the idiom in English, I'm not sure it translates, is we put ourselves in other people's shoes. Smith gives various examples. Here's one of them. When we see a stroke aimed and just ready to fall upon the leg or arm of another person, we naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or our arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. And here's my favorite illustration of what that sort of thing is like. Now, there's been a lot of psychological interest in empathy and how it works, and some really interesting discoveries. So neuroscientists, for instance, have done several experiments where they take a subject and they put the subject into a brain scanner, an fMRI. And as the person's brain's being scanned, the person is watching someone else. And this other person is experiencing some pain. Maybe they're being shocked or mildly burnt or poked. And it turns out that when you watch that and you feel empathy for that person, the very same areas in your brain light up as if you were being shocked or burnt or poked. That is, there's an expression, I feel your pain. And it seems to be literally true. There's literally a neurological overlap between the suffering of others and your own suffering. Now, many great scholars have argued that in this way empathy could be a force for good. So Dan Batson, who's probably the world's leading empathy scholar, in his book Altruism in Humans, argues for what he calls the empathy-altruism hypothesis, which is that when you feel empathy for another person, it motivates you to be more likely to help. If you're in pain and I feel your pain, I feel empathy for your pain, I'm more likely to help you, to be kind to you. Martin Hoffman, in his book Empathy and Moral Development, argues that empathy is the developmental foundation for goodness. There may be all sorts of things about morality that show up later on for adults, but for children, the starting point is empathy. Franz de Waal has written a wonderful book arguing that we don't live in an age of reason or rationality. When it comes to morality for humans and also for non-human primates, we live in an age of empathy. And probably the strongest claim is made by Simon Baron-Cohen in his book, The Science of Evil. Simon Baron-Cohen argues that evil is nothing more and nothing less than a deficiency in empathy. Having low empathy makes you an evil person, and if you're an evil person, you must be low in empathy. Now, all of the fans of empathy have a certain and powerful case to make, and it goes like this. Empathy is like a spotlight. I look at people, I look at all of you, and if I don't know you, I'm kind of indifferent to you. But if I zoom in, if I feel your pain, that could cause me to help. And the fact that a spotlight is necessary to engender care is an idea many people, good and bad, have come to. Joseph Stalin, apocryphally, famously, said, "A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic." And Mother Teresa, in an interview quite a bit before her death, said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And there's a lot of psychological research backing this up. There's some lovely experiments by Deborah Small and George Lowenstein, which show the power of empathy. So in one of their studies done many years ago, they give people a lot of information about a crisis. Forget about what this slide says. It's just statistical information about 1 million people doing that, and so many people are affected by this. And then they ask people, how much will you give? And in their study, people gave a little bit more than $1. Then for another group, there was none of this information given. Instead, there was a child with a picture and a name and an age. And this bumps up the amount of charity given a lot. And those of you who are involved in charities, this is no surprise to you. When you want to convince people to give, you don't give them a lot of statistics. You tell them a story about a person. You try to evoke their empathy. And of course, we see this in real life. I bet many of you have seen this picture. It was certainly put in enough newspapers around the world. It's a picture of the drowned Syrian boy, drowned off the beaches of Greece. And this picture had a profound effect on people's reaction to the refugee crisis. When the picture came out, for instance, there was a sudden spike in donations. in various charities. And in this way, we can see empathy could be a force for good. Now, even the biggest fan of empathy, and I'm going to sort of start my criticism now, so be prepared. Even the biggest fan of empathy has to admit that we have other forces that guide our moral judgments. So, for instance, you may be upset at all sorts of things that have no specific victim, nobody to empathize with. You may be upset about people who cheat on their taxes, or researchers who fake their data, or people who throw trash on the side of the road. You would recognize this as morally wrong, even if there's nobody to empathize with. Furthermore, there are cases where empathy and other moral considerations are at war with each other. So this is a famous experiment by Dan Batson. It's a lovely study. It goes like this. He tells his subjects in one condition about a girl, gives them her name. This is Sherry Summers. Sherry Summers is going to die. She has a terminal illness, and there's nothing you could do about that. However, there's a treatment you could give to her that would alleviate her suffering, will let her die without much pain, with dignity intact. Unfortunately, this treatment is in very short supply, and there's a waiting list for it. And she is low on the waiting list. Now, you are a hospital administrator. You can, if you want, move her up the list so she gets this treatment. But if you do, another child who is going to get the treatment will go without. Should you do it? Answer that question in your own head. When Batson asked people, he found that most people said no. Most people said, it's terrible, I wish I could help her, but if it's a fair list, it's not right to move her up. Then Batson gave another group of subjects exactly the same scenario, but with a subtle change. He said everything's the same, then he added a single sentence. And the sentence was, try to put yourself in her shoes, feel what she's feeling. Now the results flipped. Now most people wanted to move her up the list. And the way Batson views this, and I would agree with him, is that empathy here has had a negative moral effect. It led us to do something which feels right, but is actually wrong. And in general, I agree that empathy is a spotlight. But spotlights have certain problems. They have a narrow focus. And also, we often point them in the wrong places. And I want to suggest that because of the spotlight nature of empathy, it is biased, innumerate, concrete, and myopic. And I'll make that case. And one way I want to make that case is from a series of examples. And these are examples that will have a very American flavor, but I think you could find your own parallels. These are examples of things that have occupied the attention of Americans over many years, the sort of things that are in the front page of our newspaper, the front of magazines. So one is a case of a girl, baby Jessica, who fell into a well and had to be rescued. And in general, Americans are very concerned about people who fall into wells, particularly young children. A second case is Natalie Holloway. Natalie Holloway was vacationing in Aruba, and she was kidnapped and murdered. And a third case is mass shootings, particularly mass school shootings. This is a picture of somebody in Newtown, Connecticut, not far from where my wife and I live, in this terrible school shooting at Sandy Hook in which 20 children and 6 adults died. These are, without a doubt, terrible events. But the question can be asked, why do we care so much more about these events than about other events? So the psychologist Paul Slovic points out it can't be due to the objective amount of harm being done. He points out that when Natalie Holloway went missing, network television devoted 18 times more time to her, this one girl, than all of Africa, even though at the time Africa was experiencing starvation and genocides affecting tens of thousands of children. We are deeply concerned by mass shootings, but it turns out that mass shootings are relatively rare. And in the United States, they make up about 0.1% of all murders. What this means is, if you could snap your fingers and make it so there's never a mass homicide again, nobody would ever notice, because it's indistinguishable from statistical variation. Scientists have studied this in a lab. This is a lovely study done by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his research. A very simple study. He asked people, this is a time when we were very worried about birds that were covered in oil. It was a simpler time. And so he asked people, how much money would you spend to save 2,000 birds? And his subjects answered $80, 80 American dollars. Okay. Then he asked another group, how much money would you spend to save 20,000 birds? And people answered $78. 200,000 birds, $88. And he pointed out, people don't care about numbers. They just want to save a bunch of birds. And they're insensitive to numbers. Even though intellectually we could recognize that 200,000 birds is a lot more than 20,000 birds. Also, our reactions, our empathic reactions, are biased. This is a cartoon done during the height of the Ebola crisis, meant to dramatize the extent to which people focused on the very few white victims of the crisis, ignoring the many more black victims of the crisis. Now, and this same effect shows up in the neuroscience studies. So remember I told you that we mirror the pain of others. It's true. But what I didn't tell you is whether or not we do so depends critically on who the others are. And this is my favorite study to show this. It was done in Europe with men, male soccer fans. So in one condition, the subject would be hooked up to a fMRI machine, their brains would be scanned, and they would watch somebody in pain. And they would be told, this person in pain is a fan of your soccer team. When you do that, they feel empathy, parts of their brain light up, they feel the same pain. That's one condition. In the other condition, they watch somebody in pain and are told, this man is a fan of a different soccer team. When you say that, you don't get an empathic response in the brain. In fact, what you find is parts of the brain associated with pleasure and happiness light up. And this finding shows up over and over again. Whether or not we feel empathy for somebody depends critically on who that person is. Empathy is remarkably subject to bias. Now, you might say that this is true of a lot of our mental life, certainly a lot of our emotions. They don't pay attention to numbers, they're vulnerable to bias, and so on. But empathy is particularly vulnerable to this because empathy focuses you on a single individual. It's very hard to empathize with more than one person. This is a point made humorously by the writer Annie Dillard. So she writes, there are 1.2 billion people alive now in China. To get a feel for what this means, simply take yourself in all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply by 1.2 billion. See? Nothing to it. Okay, that in brief is the case against empathy. I want to devote the rest of the talk now to considering certain replies that I've gotten and certain replies that I'm sure some of you have thought of. One is that empathy might not be perfect. Maybe it has problems, maybe it's biased, but it always makes us better. But this isn't necessarily true. So take a very important case, the case of aid to the developing world by the West. A lot of this aid is very well intentioned and driven by empathic concerns. But there's tremendous debate over whether this aid is actually making the world better. And many scholars have argued that in some regards, it could make the world worse. And this seems paradoxical. How could this well-meaning, empathic help make things worse? Well, you could imagine certain ways in which this can happen. I'll give two examples. One is a rather gruesome example, unfortunately, from the journalist Linda Pullman. So Linda Pullman asked warlords in Sierra Leone about a certain atrocity they did. She asked them, "Why do you chop off the limbs of children?" And the answer she got surprised her. They told her, "We do it for you. We do it for the West. You don't come to our country unless we give you atrocities that capture your attention, that drive up your empathy. And when you come to our country, you pay us various taxes and money, and you help us out." So our empathy in this rather sad world is used as a tool against us to make the world worse. Or take a simpler case. If you travel in parts of the world like Africa or India, you'll see many child beggars. And it's often irresistible not to give to these kids. It's tremendously, you just really want to give to them. They strike up your emotions, your empathy. But a lot of scholars and aid workers have argued you shouldn't. When you give to these kids, much of the money they make, sometimes all of the money they make, goes to adults, adult criminals actually, who enslave these children. And so you're making the world worse. You're encouraging them to continue to enslave and brutalize children. If you want to make a difference, there's many other ways to do it. There's many charities you can give to, but you shouldn't give to these children directly. I was on a radio show in England many years ago after I finished my last book, and I hadn't thought much about empathy. And I was and we were talking about charity, and I gave this example. I said, isn't it interesting that our feelings make us do one thing, but the right thing to do is something else? And I was on a show with a minister, and she was shocked. And she said to me, "That's terrible, you telling people not to give to these kids. I always give to beggars when they ask, particularly children. And when I do, our hands touch. And I feel this human intimacy that charges me up and lights me up and makes me feel like a better person." Now, I'm very shy. And I'm also very slow on my feet when it comes to thinking about things. So I probably just said, "Well, I have to think about that." But I've been thinking about it for many years. And if I could go back, here's what I would say. It depends what you want. If you want to feel good, if you want to get a blast of happiness, definitely give to these kids. In fact, you should give a little bit to many charities, because each little bit you give will give you a little bit of happiness. Peter Singer makes the analogy to a buffet of a lot of delicious treats, and you just take one of each one. If you want to feel great, that's how to do it. If you want to actually help people, do something different. Now, it gets worse. Think about atrocities, like the lynchings of blacks in the American South, like the European Holocaust. There are all sorts of reasons for the existence of these atrocities. Dehumanization, hatred, envy, fear, anger. But one reason, which was pointed out many years ago by Adam Smith, is empathy. Not empathy for the people you're killing, of course, but empathy for those who are said to be their victims. Adam Smith noted that if you tell somebody about people who have been tormented, tortured, killed, your empathy for those people will motivate hatred and anger towards the group that is said to do it. And in fact, the lynchings of blacks were motivated by stories of blacks raping white women. Many of the assaults on Jews in Germany were motivated by stories of Jewish pedophiles preying on innocent German children. And none of this is ancient history. When we bomb a country like Syria, we tell stories of their atrocities. To the extent we ever go to war against ISIS, we will see more and more pictures and videos like this one. Now, the suffering of victims is often a good reason to act. But empathy pushes us too far. It makes us irrational. It makes us too punitive. With a student of mine at Yale, Nick Stignaro, we've been doing some studies on this. And so in one of our studies, what we do is we tell people about an atrocity. We tell them it either happens in Kenya or Egypt. And it involves the government kidnapping and ultimately torturing and killing journalists. And then we ask people, what should the American government, the journalists are American, what should the American government do? And we give a range of possibilities, all the way from nothing to stopping aid to an active invasion of the other country. And then we measure the people's empathy, because people vary in how much empathy they have. And we found, as we predicted, and other studies have found, the more empathy you have, the more punitive you are. The people who are most enthusiastic about violence and military action are often the people who have the deepest empathic feeling, for they're the most moved by the suffering of the victims. And this is a case where empathy, when many people think of empathy, they think of charity. I tend to think of war. I've been arguing about policy. But you might say, fine, I'll take seriously the arguments about empathy leading to bad policy, but what about personal value, certain valuable relationships, like between a doctor and a patient? So many people believe, the caption he has says, "It helps me empathize." Many people believe that a good doctor should feel a lot of empathy. And my response to this is, it depends what you mean by empathy. A good doctor should certainly care about his or her patients. A good doctor should try to understand his or her patients. But should a good doctor feel their pain, suffer along with them? I don't think so. And here, my argument draws upon this lovely collection of essays by Leslie Jameson called The Empathy Exams. Leslie Jameson worked as a model patient. It's like the worst job in the world. You go to a medical school and you pretend to be a patient, and then the doctors poke and prod you, and then you record how well they do. They practice on you. And one of the items that she tests people on was the empathy exams, how much they felt her pain, how much they put themselves in her shoes. But then, as she tells the story, she got sick herself, for real, and went to a series of doctors. And now her opinion changed. She went to one doctor who was very cold and distant, and she didn't like him at all. But she went to another doctor, and she was very powerfully affected by this doctor. She thought the doctor was great, even though he lacked empathy. So this is what she writes. Empathy is always perched precariously between gift and invasion. Talking about this doctor, she says, I didn't need him to be my mother, even for a day. I only needed him to know what he was doing. His calmness didn't make me feel abandoned. It made me feel secure. I needed to look at him and see the opposite of my fear, not its echo. And if you think about what you want when you're in trouble from the people who care for you, you might come to the conclusion you don't want them to suffer along with you. You want them to help you. And when you think about what it takes to be a good doctor or therapist or emergency worker, you would quickly burn out if you become awash with the suffering of those you deal with. You need some distance. To me, this is particularly the case when you think about therapy. So a good therapist should understand his or her patients, should want his or her patients to get better. But if you think that a good therapist should experience the suffering of the patients, you're misunderstanding therapy. When I go to my psychiatrist and they say, I'm so anxious, my life is terrible, I don't want her to start crying and say, oh, it's so terrible. I want her to look at me and want to make me better. The same thing holds, I think, for parents and children. So if my teenage son comes up to me and says, he's extremely upset. He left all of his homework for the last minute. It's all due tomorrow, and he's panicking. I'm not a good parent if I panic along with him. I'm at my best if I say, I love you, I want you to solve your problem. Let's step back and I'll try to work with you to solve it. Being a good parent sometimes involves not feeling the pain of your children. In fact, being a good parent sometimes involves causing the pain of your children, as when you take your young toddler to get shots for vaccines, or when you tell your older child he can't have a party on a school night, or smoke marijuana at lunch, or whatever. You can't, you take away things from them because you love them, but to do so you can't be fully enmeshed. A third objection is, okay, but forget about that. Everybody knows that people who have low empathy are terrible people. When you think about somebody with low empathy, you might think of somebody like this, Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. In particular, you might think people with low empathy are psychopaths. And am I really advising us to become psychopaths? So let's look at psychopaths a little bit. This is the psychopath test. Developed by the Canadian psychiatrist Robert Hare. These are the symptoms that go with being a psychopath. If you haven't seen this before, you could look at it and make a discovery about yourself, though I bet the psychopaths in the room already know that they're psychopaths and keep it very quiet. And it's true, one of the items on this test is callousness, lack of empathy. And it's true, psychopaths do show callousness and lack of empathy. But there's been several studies done as to which of these traits predicts bad behavior in psychopaths. When you release them from prison, which of their scores predict whether they will go on to commit further crimes? And it turns out empathy predicts nothing. If I want to know what a psychopath will do in the future, knowing their empathy score will tell me nothing. What does predict? These other characteristics. Mostly a past history of crime and lack of control. Okay, well that's for psychopaths. What about the rest of you? What's the relationship between your empathy and your bad behavior? Well, a few years ago, this great big study was done, and I hid some of the title for suspense reasons. What this study did was, it was a meta-analysis, so it took together every study done looking at the relationship between being low empathy and being aggressive. And it looked at all sorts of aggression: verbal aggression, physical aggression, sexual aggression. And it looked at all populations: children, college students, prisoners. And here's what they found. Their findings were expressed in their title: The Non-Relation Between Empathy and Aggression. Surprising results from a meta-analysis. The surprising results are, it turns out that if I have to predict how aggressive any of you would be, your empathy would tell me nothing. If I have to figure out which one of you is most likely to try to kill me after my talk, knowing your empathy scores won't tell me anything. What would tell me something? Well, the same thing as for psychopaths. The best predictor of aggression to any one of you is factors like lack of control, lack of impulse control, and your past history. If I wanted to know which one of you is going to try to beat me up after my talk, the piece of information I'd most want to know is, how often have you assaulted speakers in the past? And that will have some predictive power later on. But here's the final objection that might come to mind. If you don't have empathy, why would you ever want to make the world a better place? If I didn't feel your pain, why would I ever help you? And I've heard this objection a lot. And I'll confess, I don't really understand it. When we think about all the good things we do in our lives, and each and everybody here has done something good in the last few days, for a family member, for a friend, maybe even for a stranger. Some of it might be done out of empathy, but some of it might be done out of love, or kindness, or a sense of obligation, or not wanting to feel guilty or ashamed, or habit, or custom, or tradition. Our moral psychologies are complicated. Our emotions are complicated, and there's a lot of forces at work that guide our behavior. And this is not my insight. A lot of great scholars have made this point, that there's more to motivate us than empathy. When I give this talk, I often talk about Adam Smith, and because Adam Smith makes this point very well. But I've recently become very interested in a parallel argument coming from Buddhism. So there's a vast literature from Buddhist theology and Buddhist philosophy that asks the question, how should we be good people? And in this tradition, they make the distinction between what they call sentimental compassion, feeling the pain of another person, what I'm calling empathy, and great compassion, which is feeling love, caring about people, but not necessarily feeling their pain. And they say sentimental compassion is a disaster. If you wanted to live your life feeling other people's pain, you would so quickly become exhausted, you wouldn't be able to last a week. If you want to be a good person, have some distance and then love people from that distance. Well, that's philosophy or theology. You might be quite properly skeptical about it. But there's actually some research grounding this. And this is from a lovely collaboration between the German neuroscientist Tanja Singer and the biologist and Buddhist monk Matthew Ricard. And they were very interested in the distinction between empathy and compassion. So they did experiments. They trained subjects to either experience empathy, to think about somebody suffering and put themselves in that person's shoes, to feel what that person is feeling. They trained them to do it over the course of hours, and then days, and then weeks. And then they had another group, and they trained them to feel compassion, to think about somebody who's suffering and not feel the suffering at all. Instead, feel love towards them, what the Buddhists call loving kindness towards them. Now, it turned out that these two sorts of practices, empathy and compassion, had different effects on the brain. Different parts of the brain were active in the course of this. But more interesting for our purposes, they had different effects. And in the journal Current Biology, Tanja Singer and a colleague summarizes them. So compassion is an other-related emotion. It leads to positive feelings like love. It leads to good health, approach, and social motivation. But empathy leads to distress, what's called empathic distress. And this makes you think about yourself. It's a self-related emotion. It leads to negative feelings like stress. It leads to poor health, burnout, withdrawal, and non-social behavior. Now, this is work from one laboratory, but there's other research that backs it up. There's a lot of research studying mindfulness meditation. Does anybody here practice mindfulness meditation? A few. Well, mindfulness meditation is said to have various health benefits, but a series of studies finds it also makes you nicer. It makes you more generous and more kind. And Nobody knows exactly why, but one explanation is it makes you kind because it shuts down your empathy. And this is a conclusion some researchers find in a paper called Meditation Increases Compassionate Responses to Suffering. And they conclude meditation-based training enables practitioners to move quickly from feeling the distress of others to acting with compassion to alleviate it. Okay. Now, at this point, you probably think that I'm against empathy. And that's sort of right. I'm against empathy as a moral guide. I'm against empathy as a guide to making us good people. But I'm not against empathy in general. Empathy, among other things, can be a huge source of pleasure. So take one example, which was pointed out by Adam Smith. This is one of my sons, much younger than he is now. One of the great pleasures of having children is that you get to have experiences that you've had 1,000 times before. Eating an ice cream sundae, watching fireworks, seeing a Hitchcock movie. And you get to experience them all over again for the first time through the eyes of your child. More generally, empathy is at the root of the pleasure we get from reading, from novels, from movies, from most of all, the best experience of all, television. And that we have this appetite for putting ourselves in the shoes of other people and experiencing what they experience. Now, at this point, one might say, well, one sec. In this, one could find a final argument in favor of empathy. And it's that the stories we encounter, like the novels we read or the movies we see, can drive us to feel empathy towards a certain group, can focus that spotlight towards a group and make the world a better place. And this is a point made by one of my favorite philosophers, Martha Nussbaum. And she's talking here about Greek tragedies. And she writes, although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies were male, they were asked to have empathy with the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. And it's been argued that the empathic power of fiction has led to valuable social changes. So here's a very American example. It was said that at the height of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln invited Harriet Beecher Stowe, the writer, to the White House, and upon seeing her, said, "So you're the little woman who started this great big war." And he was talking about her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is by no means a great work of literature or theology or philosophy, but what it does is it gets you to put yourself in the shoes of slaves and experience the horrors of slavery. And by doing so, it's often argued, this was a catalyst for a war that was motivated, at least in part, by a desire to end the institution of slavery. And there are more recent examples. Many people have argued that television shows like Will and Grace and Modern Family that depict gay men and gay women in a positive light and get you to feel empathy for them play a positive social role in changing real-world attitudes towards these people. I don't doubt that this is possible, but I'm enough of an empathy skeptic to point out something else, which is the spotlight of empathy could be pointed in ways that we might view as progressive and positive, but it could be pointed in other ways as well. This is my favorite book in the world. It's Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. And if you haven't read it, I envy you because you'll have the chance to read it. But it's a story of a much older man's infatuation and desire to seduce a young girl just past puberty. And here's the wonderful and terrible thing about this book. You can't get more than 20 pages in before you start to root for the man. It's written in the first person, and you're drawn to feel empathy towards him. And this empathy has this powerful pull where you'll take his side. And this is just one case among many where you could empathize with the bad person. So the problem is, for every Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a Mein Kampf. For every Schindler's List, which gets you to feel empathy for the victims of the Holocaust, there's a Birth of a Nation, which gets you to feel empathy for the Ku Klux Klan, a powerful racist group in America. I don't care about terminology. I don't care how you use the term empathy or its Polish equivalent. You could use the term any way you want. If the way you choose to use the word empathy is to refer to concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality, all these good things, then I'm not against empathy. I'm against something very specific, however you call it. I'm against putting yourself in the shoes of other people. I think this can be a wonderful source of pleasure. I'd like us to continue watching movies and reading novels. But I think when it comes to making moral decisions, from deciding how to act as individuals and as a society, it is a moral disaster, and it makes us worse people. So I'm against empathy, and I encourage you to join me in a crusade against this terrible emotion. Thank you.
I believe we have time for some questions, but they should be posed in English because of the requirements of our live transmission.
Thank you. I will make a very simplistic approach, which will be naive, but because of time limit. I feel like empathy is a tool which was developed during all society's development to make better cooperation between people. And we need to use that tool because we are simply saying stupid enough to not act properly. So I could imagine there will be one day then starting from the society will start to use less empathy and more wisdom. What do you think about such approach, describing empathy as a kind of handicap, which was necessary for social relation development during the past times, and maybe one day will be not needed anymore?
I appreciate the question. It's a lovely way to put it, and I'm very sympathetic to the idea. I think empathy arose through natural selection, through biological evolution, and it is, as you put it, a tool that led to benefits. We wouldn't have it if it didn't. In particular, I think the empathy we feel towards our friends and family help small groups flourish. But I think to some extent, as we're in a society with millions and then billions of people, we could then put it aside and favor reason and rationality. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. You're right to sort of be, I detect a little bit of skepticism in your question, and you're right to do so, but it's possible. I'll give it as an example, charities. A while ago, when people decided what charities to give to, they were entirely swayed by the pictures. Is it of a baby, a sad baby, a beautiful child or something? But now more and more people, when they're deciding whether to give to charity, are demanding to know, what good will it do? And there's many websites that give you information. And so even for this small domain, we're smart enough to say, yes, the pictures will affect me, but I don't care about that. I'm going to try to use my wisdom to answer, and I'd like to think we could do that for our lives in general.
I think that there is a rule of empathy that wasn't mentioned yet, and yet I think it's very important. The rule that mother gives to a child when a child didn't have a words to name its feelings, and by empathy, maybe all psychological feelings and way to deal with them are starting to grow up. And I think
that's a superb point, and there's quite a bit of scientific evidence supporting your claim about that role of empathy. So it turns out that oxytocin, a hormone that is involved in empathy, if we were to all take shots of oxytocin, we'd all feel waves of empathy towards each other, is also active in childbirth and breastfeeding, suggesting that empathy plays a critical role in the caring of babies and young children. That may well be. I guess what I wonder about is, do you need the sharings of feelings by mothers and babies in order to have proper outcomes for the babies, or is it enough to have understanding? And in fact, there's a lot of cases where there's abuse by the mother towards the baby, and there's some studies suggesting that high empathy may be the culprit behind that the baby is anxious and upset and crying, and the mother feels too much what the baby feels, and it's too upsetting. So I think you're raising an excellent point, and I would be cautious. I don't want to rid the world of empathy, and I would be very cautious before telling mothers with babies that empathy is a bad idea. I want to be unsure about that. But that's an excellent point, and I would agree with you.
You've mentioned this example of poor children in India, by which helping individually one does not really help to solve a problem. So my question is, would you argue that other forms of such behavior aiming to help an individual and not aiming to solve a problem in a wider perspective is wrong? For example, we had a story in Poland, like a person helping a homeless man buying some food on Facebook, getting thousands of likes and huge response on the internet. So would you argue that other forms, because this you've mentioned one particular case, would you argue that other forms of such behavior that only aim to help one individual and not solve a problem in wider perspective are wrong? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked that. I actually would not argue that. I think, for instance, if giving the child food made the world even just a tiny bit better, helped that child, then other things being equal, we should do that. My concern was that in that particular case, by doing so, in the long run, you make things worse, not better. To a large extent, I'm a philosophical utilitarian, which is, I believe we should act in ways that make people happier. And so even if it's just one person, it's a good thing. The problem is, it's a complicated world. And sometimes helping somebody immediately not only has a limited effect, but could have a bad effect. And so I think in general, if we want to help people, both communities of people, but also individual people. And again, imagine a parent and a child doesn't want to do his homework. And you know what would make him feel much better? If you took him out for ice cream and say, oh, don't worry about the homework, let's go out for ice cream and everything like that. But that wouldn't be good parenting. That would help in the immediate short term. Imagine a teenager for a friend who's addicted to drugs, where giving him some heroin would cause him in the short term immediate pleasure. but in the long run, problems. So I'm not against doing things that have a little bit of good. That's much of what life is, and that's terrific. But I think in the end we have to be rational and somewhat cold-blooded in saying, what will the effects of these things be? And acknowledge that actions that might feel good may actually have, on balance, bad effects. It's a great question.
You mentioned mostly scientific research about how it is that people use their empathy wrong. But besides scientific research, you also shown us a lot of media reports. For example, that the Natalie, I don't remember her surname, but she had a lot of airtime during the moment. And I was wondering, how much do you think it's the media's fault that people are using empathy wrong, and how much it's the people's fault itself?
I think it's a great question. I think there's enough blame to go around. The reason why the media does it is because it's what we want. It's our fault, it's your fault, and mine. So the media focuses on Natalie Holloway because nobody cares about the Africans. Only the Africans care about the Africans, but the Americans care immensely about this attractive white teenage girl. So they give us their businesses, they give us what we want. When a politician, and we have in my country a big debate right now about healthcare, and instead of making arguments that this healthcare policy will help so-and-so people, will cost less, instead of making arguments about the critical facts, the way politicians in my country argue is they stand up and they reach in their pocket and says, I have a letter from an 11-year-old. And they read out the letter, and it's some terrible story of how their opponent's healthcare made her lose her legs and her dog died. And you could blame the politician, but the politician is doing what the people are allowing. So that sketches out a solution, which is if the readers of magazines and newspapers, the watchers of TV, demanded statistical and factual arguments, demanded that the stories that were most important, objectively important, got the most coverage, journalists would change how they act. Whenever a politician says, I want to tell you a story, people booed, politicians would stop doing it. And so I think part of what we can do is, I'd like to see a cultural change where we recognize that these appeals to the emotion might feel right, but lead us to directions that are objectively wrong.
Okay, maybe it's not a question, a reflection rather, and I'm looking forward to reading your book to understand more. I thought that maybe you're making a case not against empathy, but against all, or not all, a lot of evil drives or emotions in disguise. Because the case was not against empathy, but if we want to help one person and not 10 million Ethiopians, maybe we are being irrational. If we don't feel for a football fan of an opposite team, or we want our government to bomb, terrorists for our journalists, maybe we are feeding our hate, and maybe there is no empathy. It's something else. If we want to give money to children, to beggars, maybe it's our selfishness, not empathy. We want to feel better. So the real empathy seems to be a positive thing, but all these things are not really empathy, Wouldn't you? I mean, that's what I thought now. Thank you.
I like the question. I would make the argument that each of my cases, we could zoom in and show that it is in fact empathy and not these other considerations that are driving it. But I agree with your main point. I want to make an art. You've caught me. I have an agenda here. My agenda is to promote rational deliberation when it comes to policy and when it comes to moral decisions. Emotions are wonderful. It's a shame I'm talking against emotion, where emotion is here. I think this is emotion. But when it comes to policy and morality, I think emotion leads us astray. But if I was to stand up and say, I'm going to argue against anger or greed, or, you would say, okay, whatever, I believe you. So what I want to do in this book is I want to take the emotion you are most positive towards and say, the most beloved emotion of all, you see this one? Even that one will lead you astray. So I think I've made a case against empathy in particular, but you are entirely right that my case is more generally against emotions. If I was to give my book a different title, it would be, Don't Listen to Your Heart.
I think perhaps our electorate's a little bit more perceptive, because we, for every Bill Clinton feeling somebody's pain, there's a Joe the plumber that maybe isn't quite so effective. But my question is a little different. I think you make a very strong case about the misappropriation of limited resources to deal with real problems caused by empathetic feelings. But you also showed a slide where there was a great spike in people's willingness to give when they were confronted with an image which evoked emotion. So my question is this: given the effectiveness of empathy in drawing out help from people, what would be your recipe for bringing out the same amount of passion from people on the basis of a rational, dispassionate cost-benefit analysis on the balance of probabilities with regard to outcomes?
It's a very good question. You softened me up with the Joe the plumber reference, which maybe not many people get, but I just love that reference. I'll first concede something, which I conceded here, but I'll make more explicit, and it's related to the man's question earlier, which is empathy is a powerful tool. And if you have a good objective in mind, empathy could be used to drive people to do it. In some way, it's like racism. I think racism is wrong. But I wouldn't doubt for a moment that people could use racism to get positive ends. Suppose there's two politicians, and one of them is terrible, and a terrible one happens to be black. And I go to America and I use racist sentiments to get people not to vote for the terrible one. Maybe I made the world a better place. Even through all sorts of things can be tools. I think we have alternatives to empathy, and alternatives to racism, and alternatives to anger and appeals to selfishness and greed. I think people are sensitive to rational argument. I think we can be motivated by a more distant love and compassion. I think people want to do the right thing. Are these motivations as powerful as empathy or racism or other things? Maybe not. Maybe not. We may have to wean ourselves away from tools that are particularly powerful and towards things that I think lead to better overall outcomes. But if you really wanted to get something done, convince people of something, you said, I'm going to use empathy to do the trick, I wouldn't argue with you that your method is ineffective.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question my mom asked me for, actually. And it's a question about the Eastern religious system. You told us about children in India. And there is something about Eastern religious system you also told us about, that there is a lack of this empathy, this compassion for other people. But on the other hand, right now here, we've got a culture which, the fundamentals of its culture, it's the Christian culture, mainly. And really, important part in these fundamentals are compassion, are this, feeling love, feeling, that we want to help other people in our group. And right now we are in a world when those Western societies, these societies which foundation is this Christian culture, there's a lot more, a lot more charity. People are treating better than in India, for example, because there, like everybody's fate, it's his fault, his or she's fault. So he not deserve any compassion, and we haven't gotten here. And I think that word here is quite better than there. And what you think about like this foundation of different cultures and that's all.
It's a really interesting point. I'm not sure I could fully address it, but let me talk about one aspect of what you said, which involves religion. I think to some extent, and people here could correct me, it's an interesting issue, the argument for compassion over empathy is something which shows up in all of the world's major religions. I talked about Buddhism because of the neuroscience studies which interested me, but it's true also in Christianity. So in Christianity, there's, of course, a lot of forces to love those close to you, your neighbor, your child, your family member. But the moral force of a lot of Christianity has been to expand the scope of concern. In the story of the Good Samaritan, in a lot of people, of the claim to love thy enemy, is to say, look, your moral feelings towards those close to you are very powerful, but to be a good person, you have to extend beyond them. My own feeling, and this is a sort of a more direct answer to your question, more positive, is that every moral system in the world, and every mainstream religious system, every secular philosophy, every mainstream religious system carries within it the message that we should have an objective morality that transcends the limits of emotion. That we should care for people even if they are not pretty, even if they don't share our blood, even if they aren't right next to each other, next to us. Does that answer your question, or do you feel that there's... Okay.
I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you once more, Professor. Proszę Państwa, za niecałe 20 minut rozpocznie się debata pod tajemniczym tytułem Emocje w wieży Babel.